Hey everybody, welcome back. It's time to revise. We're going to be looking at comparison of approaches today for AQA Psych Paper 2. Let's do it. There they are, look. Some tasty looking exam questions. Here's your chance to pause the video, give it a go, come back, I'll talk through. Go for it. You know you want to. Alright, let's do it. Okay, so we want to explain a difference between the cognitive approach and the behaviorist approach. So probably the most obvious thing to go for is the behaviorist approach says that there is no internal processing between stimulus and response, whereas the cognitive approach assumes that internal processing between stimulus and response affects behavior. Okay, so it's that focus on what's going on in the mind versus just observable behaviours. So you could word it that way if you like. Explain one way in which social learning theory overlaps with one other approach. Now, for me, the most obvious ones that come to mind are behaviorism and the cognitive approach. So let's briefly talk about both. Social learning theory overlaps with behaviorism because they both emphasise the role of learning. For example, social learning theory focuses on vicarious reinforcement, and behaviorism includes positive and negative reinforcement. That's plenty for 2 marks. If you pick cognitive, you could say that one area that social learning theory overlaps with the cognitive approach is that they both emphasise the role of internal mental processing. So that's 1 mark. Let's explain it. Social learning theory emphasises the role of mediational processes, such as attention, and the cognitive approach focuses on the role of schema. Done. Explain one similarity between the biological approach and one other approach. I'm not going to go through every single pairing, but let's just pick a couple. Let's say, what should we do? Let's do behaviorism. That's a fun one. Okay, one similarity between the biological and the behaviorist approach is their emphasis on the scientific method. The biological approach uses controlled objective measures such as brain scans, and the behaviorist approach relies on controlled lab studies. There you go. I suppose you could give the example of Pavlov or Skinner's research if you really wanted to, but it's only 2 marks. If we picked, let's go for the psychodynamic approach, why not? One similarity between the biological approach and the psychodynamic approach is their emphasis on the role of inheritance. There you go. Were you expecting me to say that? The biological approach argues that behaviour is a result of genetics that are passed down from our parents. The psychodynamic approach puts emphasis on the role of the superego in behaviour, and the superego is inherited from our same-sex parent, our same-sex role model. There you go. Just an example. Right, now we want to do the same thing really, but we've also got to do a difference. That's why it's 4 marks now. So, explain one similarity and one difference between the behaviorist and humanistic approaches. Right, what could we say? One similarity between the behaviorist and the humanistic approach is that they both acknowledge the role of the environment. Behaviorist approaches emphasise the role of conditioning and reinforcement. Similarly, the humanistic approach acknowledges the effect that other people's attitudes have on us, for example, in its concept of conditions of worth. A difference between the behaviourist and the humanistic approach might be that they differ on their views on free will and determinism. The behaviourist approach rejects free will in favour of environmental determinism, whereas the humanistic approach emphasises the role of autonomy and free will. Outline social learning theory. Explain one difference between it and one other approach. So, this could be maybe a 3 marks of knowledge plus 2 comparison, or 2 plus 3, it doesn't really matter, but the key thing being we need to cover both of those skills. So to outline social learning theory, you can talk about things like mediational processes, so attention, retention, motivation, motor reproduction ability. You could talk about the role of models and identification and imitation. You could talk about the role of vicarious reinforcement. There's lots of different concepts there. So I'm not going to go through all of those because that's probably for another video or another time. But some knowledge of the theory itself and its assumptions. In terms of a difference, What could we do? Social learning theory, and I think we already talked about behaviorism and cognitive as similarities. Let's do something different. Let's do biological. Okay, so one difference between social learning theory and the biological approach is, what could we say, their stance on determinism. The biological approach adopts a hard determinist stance by emphasizing the role of biological or genetic determinism and excluding free will, whereas Bandura's social learning theory leans more towards soft determinism because it acknowledges the role of reciprocal determinism, so the idea that we could have an impact on our environment and that can have an impact on us as well. There you go, just an example. Okay, next one. Explain two key features of the psychodynamic approach and briefly compare it with another approach. So a similar setup to the previous question, slightly briefer knowledge, just two key features, so probably 1 mark for each, and then briefly compare it with one other approach. Okay, or I suppose it could be actually, it could be 4 marks of knowledge there, so 2 marks for 2 key features, because it then says briefly compare it, so maybe it's 2 marks for comparison. Again, you're not going to know on the day, just try and cover both skills as best you can. So, 2 key features, what could we say? So the psychodynamic approach assumes that the unconscious conflicts and drives that we experience shape our behaviour. Yeah? For example, the role of the conflict between the superego and the id is important in driving our behaviour. We could also say, a less kind of knowledge and theory point of view, but still a key feature of the approach, we could say that another feature of the psychodynamic approach is rejection of the scientific method. We could talk about the role of unobservable behaviour and how maybe because all of our experiences are different, maybe it's leaning towards a slightly more idiographic way of doing psychology. Okay, but whatever features you pick, it doesn't matter. Like I said, it's a different video talking about the knowledge of the psychodynamic approach. Let's talk about comparison. So it just says one other approach. You can pick whatever you like. Let's go for, what have we not really talked about much so far? Maybe cognitive or humanistic, something like that. So let's compare with humanistic. One similarity between the psychodynamic and humanistic approach is that they both make use of case studies and focus on a more holistic way of understanding individuals. A difference, however, might be their stance on free will. The psychodynamic approach rejects the notion of free will and says that our behaviour is entirely determined. Yeah, it uses psychic determinism. Whereas the humanistic approach emphasises empowerment, free will, autonomy. There you go. If we picked cognitive, you could say that one similarity between the psychodynamic and cognitive approaches is their focus on internal processes. Both emphasise the role of mental factors, don't they? But they are different, and that's where we're going to turn this into a difference. So despite this, one difference between the two approaches is that the psychodynamic approach emphasises the role of the unconscious, whereas the cognitive approach allows for some degree of conscious and subconscious processing. Okay. Right, we now have compare the behaviorist approach with one other approach to psychology. So for this, we are obviously going to bring out some knowledge to actually compare them, but the command word is just compare. So you just need to go straight in here and do maybe 3 different comparison paragraphs to cover those 8 marks. So, behaviorist approach, what could we pick? Let's go for biological. I don't know if I've already talked about that. I've forgotten what I said a few minutes ago. Let's go for biological anyway. So, similarities between the behaviorist and the biological approach. Well, they're both scientific method, so you can do a bit of a discussion about that. They both reject free will, yeah, but you could develop that paragraph in terms of talking about, okay, well, that's a similarity, but behaviorist actually says it's about environmental determinism, whereas biological says it's about genetic or biological determinism. So you could develop similarities and say, actually, yes, they both do this, but in different ways. You could do it that way to compare. You could, I'll tell you what, actually, something I don't think I have mentioned yet today, any kind of comparison question like this, you could compare in terms of their real-world application to therapies. So why not do that? One similarity between the behaviorist and the biological approach is that they've both led to important therapies for mental health. Yeah, you could say that behaviorist theory has led to treatments for phobias, biological theory has led to treatments for OCD and depression. Yeah, so that's another similarity. You could talk about differences, as I mentioned, in terms of their stance on free will and determinism. You could talk about differences in terms of their emphasis on nature or nurture. So there's loads of different stuff you could do there. But the important thing is the command word is compare. So you're going to have paragraphs that do similarities and differences. It's not really evaluate. Okay, for this 16 marker, we've got 6 marks of knowledge to describe the features of the cognitive approach. So just go through your key knowledge, your key concepts like schema, computer model, all of that stuff. And then we've got 10 marks left, and we're going to compare it with the biological approach. So, a few ideas. It's going to be quite repetitive, so I'm not going to go through it all in depth. But again, things like their stance on the scientific method, they're similar in that sense. Talking about the role of the mind versus more physiological, the body stuff. You could talk about applications, mention maybe CBT as opposed to drug therapy, and talk about it that way. Yeah. You could talk about determinism and free will. You could talk about reductionism. They're both quite reductionist, aren't they? So we've got biological reductionism versus machine reductionism. And actually, biological reductionism, to develop that argument, is at a lower level of explanation. It's more reductionist than machine reductionism. Okay. Let's have a little think about this last one, and then you can go about your day. Some people argue that the humanistic approach has little to offer psychology. Discuss the humanistic approach and compare it with one other approach. Again, we're going to have 6 marks for knowledge here. So you're going to outline the cognitive, what am I talking about, the humanistic approach, and then 10 marks for comparison with one other approach. Now, the key thing here, yes, you can pick your approach, but it does say one other approach. So what the examiner will probably do is look at your best one and ignore everything else. But why waste time on a second one? Yeah, pay attention to the question, one other approach. Up to you. I'm not going to go through all the different combinations. We've talked a lot about how to compare already and the kind of things that you can compare them on. So, sorry to disappoint, but there you go. All right, time to reflect. What happened? Why did that happen? And so what? What's next on your learning journey? I can't believe I said learning journey. There you go. That was me discussing some comparison questions for approaches. I hope that was useful. The key thing, remember, think about the themes that you can use to compare. Things like scientific method, applications, yeah, all that sort of stuff. Free will, determinism, nature, nurture, reductionism. Use some of that to compare. Yeah, but you do need to be a bit more free and willing to just apply what you know in these comparison questions. Remember that compare is not the same as evaluate. All right. Hope that was helpful. See you again soon, guys. Keep it up. Bish bash bosh.